The job was supposed to be a straightforward repaint of a 3-story home in West Vancouver. High ceilings, open concept, the kind of place where everything was either white oak or Calacatta marble, and the designer had already sent over a color sheet before anyone swung a brush. I'd done jobs like this before. Show up, tape the trim, roll the walls, invoice the GC, move on. 2 weeks, maybe 3. By the time I pulled into the driveway, I could already tell something was wrong. 2 work vans were parked sideways near the garage, and a plumber's truck was half blocking the turnaround. I grabbed my bag, walked around the side of the house, and stepped through the open front entry into what looked like a flood response. Water was pooling across the limestone floor of the main hall, coming from somewhere up near the kitchen. 2 plumbers were standing over a shut-off valve, arguing about whose crew had moved it. A drywall sub was on the phone with his voice raised. My foreman Phil was already inside with his arms crossed, watching the whole thing like he was calculating exactly how much it was going to push the schedule back. Then I saw her. She was standing near the kitchen island with a clipboard in one hand, and her phone face down in the other, which struck me immediately, because every other person in that house had their phone pressed to their ear. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't yelling. She was watching, cataloging. There was a stillness about her that felt completely out of place in the noise. Dark blazer, hair pulled back, the kind of calm that either comes from years of experience or from deciding somewhere along the way that losing composure is a waste of good energy. Her eyes moved to me the second I walked in. "You're the painter." "Drew," I said, "I'm the painter." She looked at the floor, then back at me. "Tell me honestly, can you still work around this, or do we need to push the whole schedule?" Phil started to answer. She held up one hand without looking at him, kept her eyes on me. I looked at the water, traced where it had come from, checked the walls nearest the source. The drywall was wet in a 2-meter section near the pantry door. Everything else looked clean. If they get the water stopped in the next half hour and we dry the subfloor properly, I can work around it. That pantry section will need to be re-skimmed before I touch it. Everything else starts tomorrow as planned. She nodded once, slowly, like she was weighing it against 3 other options she'd already run through in her head. "Fine," she said. "That's what we do." Nobody questioned it. That surprised me. Rooms full of contractors don't usually defer that fast to someone who isn't holding a wrench. She introduced herself 20 minutes later when the arguing had settled into the low hum of people, pretending they hadn't just been arguing. Celeste Harmon, owner of the property and founder of a Vancouver-based architecture and interiors firm. I vaguely recognized because they'd done a building in Gastown that had gotten written up somewhere. I looked her up that night in the van before I drove off, sitting in the dark driveway with the rain starting against the windshield, and felt something shift in my chest that I told myself was just the tail end of a long day. She wasn't supposed to be at the house much after that. Most owners at this level of renovation aren't. They have project managers and site reps for exactly that reason. But Celeste kept showing up. Not every day, but enough that after the first week I'd started noticing the particular sound of her car on the gravel. A dark gray Volvo she drove like it was a hatchback she'd owned for years and didn't feel the need to impress anyone with. On the 4th day, she walked through the main floor while I was cutting in the trim work and stopped at the staircase. Watched me for a minute without saying anything. "You're fast," she said finally. "You're paying by the day, not the hour." That got a small sound from her. Not quite a laugh, but close. "Is that how it works?" "Depends on the contractor. I just like clean lines." She looked at the wall where I'd been working. I could see her actually looking at it, not just glancing to be polite. "That's the right shade," she said, quieter, almost to herself. The designer wanted to go a shade lighter. I pushed back. Nobody agreed with me. I kept working. The lighter one would have washed out in the afternoon light. This one holds. She turned and looked at me properly for the first time that week. Not with surprise. More like recognition. She left her direct number on a sticky note on my toolbox before she left that day. Told me to use it if anything came up that Phil couldn't sort out on site. I said I would. Then I stood there looking at that note for longer than made sense, with my brush still in my hand and the trim half done. 3 weeks into the job, she texted me on a Thursday evening. Nothing urgent. Just, "The tile samples came in for the lower hall. Can you look at them before I sign off? I want your eye on the grout color before we commit." I told her I'd be there at 7 the next morning. She said 7 was fine. What I didn't expect was for her to be there at 7 too, with 2 coffees in paper cups from the place on Marine Drive, and no one else on site yet. We stood in the lower hallway in the quiet of a gray North Shore morning and looked at tile samples in natural light, which is the only real way to look at tile samples. and she listened when I talked in the way that made me slow down a little, instead of speeding through what I had to say. The warm grout, I told her. Not the white. White will show everything within a year, and you'll spend the rest of your life looking at the ghost of every boot that ever tracked through here. She chose the warm grout. We stood there for a moment after, both looking at the sample board. Do you always have opinions about this kind of thing? She asked. Only when I'm asked. You weren't really asked. No, I said, but the white grout was a bad idea. She almost smiled. I know, I just wanted to hear someone say it out loud. The room I wasn't supposed to see was off a back corridor on the second floor, behind a door that looked like a linen closet from the outside. She opened it on a Tuesday's evening when I was finishing up late, and had gone back upstairs to pull my drop cloths off the guest room floor. She didn't explain why she opened it. She just said, "Come look at this for a second," in a voice that was different from the one she used on site, quieter, less certain. Inside was not a linen closet. It was a room maybe half the size of the guest room next door, with a long work table under the window and metal shelving along two walls. On the shelves were ceramic pieces, bowls, narrow vases, sculptural forms that didn't resolve into anything recognizable, all in muted grays and ochres and the occasional deep terracotta. Some were finished, some were clearly still in progress, rougher, less refined. The whole room had that particular smell of dried clay and something faintly earthy underneath. And on the work table were tools I recognized from a pottery class I'd taken for about 6 weeks in my early 20s, before I accepted that patience was not my strong suit. I didn't say anything for a moment. This didn't make it onto the renovation plans, she said. I noticed. The designer doesn't know about it. The project manager doesn't know about it. My assistant has never been in here. She said it flatly, like a list of facts rather than a confession. I didn't plan to show you. I looked at the pieces on the shelving, really looked at them. There was a bowl on the second shelf with a slight asymmetry in the rim that looked intentional rather than like a mistake. Like the maker had known exactly when to stop correcting it. It was the most alive thing I'd seen in the whole house. That one, I said. Which? I pointed. She looked at it for a moment, then back at me. That's the first one I made that I didn't hate the next day, she said. I understood that more than I expected to. I told her so. She didn't ask me to explain it. We stood in that room for another 10 minutes, not saying much. And when I left the house that evening, I sat in the van in the dark driveway again, raining, because it's the North Shore and it's almost always raining, and I didn't start the engine for longer than I'd like to admit. The dinner happened by accident, the way those things usually do. It was a Friday. Past 6, the rest of the crew had cleared out. I was running a final check on the second floor trim, and she was somewhere in the house doing whatever she did in the evenings when the site went quiet. I found her in the kitchen, standing at the island with her laptop open, and a look on her face I'd started to recognize as her working through something expression. You should go home, I said. You're still here. I'm billing for it. She laughed once, genuine, and closed the laptop. Then she looked at the fridge like it had personally let her down and said, I keep meaning to actually stock this house. I keep not doing it. She opened the fridge, stared into it, then looked at me. There's leftover pasta from the caterer's Monday and some kind of cheese situation. I don't know what half of it is. What's the cheese situation? She pulled out a paper bag from the deli at Park Royal. We ended up at the island with 2 plates of warmed-up pasta and a cheese board she arranged with more care than the situation probably required. And we talked for almost 2 hours. About the job at first, then about the firm she'd built, how she'd started it at 29 with 2 employees, and a lease she couldn't really afford in a walk-up on West Hastings. How she'd grown it to 40 people and somehow that had made her feel further from the work she'd actually loved, not closer to it. I talked about the workshop I wanted to open someday. Small, restoration-focused, the kind of place that took on one interesting job at a time instead of running 5 crews across the lower mainland simultaneously. She asked questions about it that nobody ever asked, specific ones. About what kind of work I'd take and what I'd turn down and what I'd call it. You talk about it like it's a long shot, she said. It is. Commercial lease prices in this city aren't exactly encouraging. That's a logistics problem, not a vision problem. She said it like there was a clear difference, and for a second I felt it too. When I left, she walked me to the front door. Rain was hammering the stone steps outside. This was nice, she said. I agreed that it was. Then I drove home on the upper levels highway, with the wipers going full speed and the radio off, turning that evening over in my head like I was trying to find something wrong with it, and not quite managing to. If you've made it this far, hit subscribe and leave a like. It genuinely helps more than you'd think. Because what I'm about to tell you is the part I've never said out loud to anyone. She called me a week later on a Wednesday evening when I was parked outside a job in North Burnaby, eating a sandwich in the van. Not a text, an actual call. "I'm driving out to Ambleside," she said. "I don't want to go alone. Are you done for the day?" I looked at my sandwich. "Give me 20 minutes. We walked the seawall as far as the park and back, with the wind off Burrard Inlet cold enough to make it feel like November even though it was September. She had her hands in her pockets and her hair loose, and she looked nothing like the woman who'd stood in a flooded hallway in West Van and made 5 contractors stop arguing with one sentence. She looked like someone who'd been running at full output for a very long time, and had just for one evening decided to stop. We got tea from the stand near the parking lot and sat on a bench facing the water. The lions were out above the tree line across the inlet, the last of the light going orange on the peaks. "Do you actually like doing this?" she asked. "The painting, the sights, the whole thing?" I thought about it properly before I answered. "I like working with my hands," I said. "I like that at the end of a day there's something I can point to. The scale of it right now isn't what I'd choose forever, but it's honest work." She turned her cup in both hands. "My firm does $60 million projects, and sometimes I finish a week, and I can't tell you what I actually made." I looked at her. "That's why the room." She nodded slowly. "That's why the room." The water was dark below the last light. Freighters anchored out in the inlet, lit up against the dusk. I asked her what she wanted that didn't show up in any pitch deck or annual report. She was quiet long enough that I thought she wasn't going to answer. Then she said, "To feel like myself for more than 2 consecutive hours." There was no self-pity in it. That's the part that stayed with me. She wasn't asking for sympathy. She was just telling me something true, and she'd chosen me to tell it to. And I didn't fully understand why. But sitting there in the cold with tea going tepid in my hands, looking at the mountains across the inlet, I had the clear feeling that whatever was happening between us had already moved past the point where either of us could plausibly call it nothing. After that evening, the excuses for seeing each other got thinner. Then they disappeared. She'd call after the site had cleared out, and I'd find myself turning off the highway toward West Van, instead of heading back to my place in East Van. Sometimes she was still in work mode when I arrived, and we'd sit in the kitchen or the pottery room while she wound down, the way people do when they trust that you don't need to be entertained. Sometimes she'd have a bottle of BC Pinot open, and she'd pour a glass without asking, and that felt like its own kind of easy intimacy, the kind that sneaks up on you. I noticed the things you notice when you start paying a different kind of attention. The way she kept her phone face down when we talked. The way she remembered things I'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier, and brought them back up without making a point of it. The way the lines around her eyes softened when she laughed about something real versus something politely amusing. And underneath all of it, the slow building awareness that I was in trouble in a way that had nothing to do with the job. The problem was the voice in my head that wouldn't quiet down. The one that sounded reasonable and said things like, "You know how this goes. She's in a particular season of her life and you showed up at the right time. Eventually the season changes." I kept that voice to myself for a while, let it sit in the back of everything like a low-grade pressure, present enough to notice, not quite bad enough to force a conversation. But it had a way of leaking out around the edges. I'd go quiet at the wrong moment, or I'd leave earlier than I needed to, or she'd reach across the counter and I'd be a half-second slow responding in a way she clearly noticed even if she didn't say so. One Sunday afternoon she put down what she was working on, looked at me and said, "You're leaving before you leave." "I'm standing right here." "No," she said. "You're already halfway out the door and you haven't moved." I didn't answer that honestly. I should have. Instead I said something vague about being tired from the week and she let it go, but the way she let it go told me she wasn't done with it. She asked me to come to a firm event at a gallery on Granville Island. A Tuesday evening, a client preview for a project they'd just wrapped. "It's not a big thing," she said. "One drink. We leave early. I'd like you there." I looked at my work clothes hanging on the back of the bathroom door and said, "Celeste." "What?" "That's not my world." There was a pause on the line. When she spoke again, her voice was careful in a way it hadn't been before. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means I don't know how to do that evening." "I'm not asking you to perform," she said. "I'm asking you to show up. There's a difference for you. For me, there's not." She didn't argue, but I could hear the silence shift in quality. Before she said she'd talk to me later and hung up. She called back 40 minutes later. Every time you say something like that, she said, it's not humility. It's you telling me I don't know my own mind. I want you to hear me clearly, Drew. I know exactly what my life looks like. I built it. And I know the difference between someone interesting for a season and someone I can't stop thinking about. They are not the same experience. They do not feel the same. Do not tell me what I'm feeling. I went to the event. It was uncomfortable for the first 20 minutes. Too many sharp suits. Too many people doing the greeting as networking thing. One man who asked me with a very particular kind of smile what I did, and then visibly recalibrated when I told him. But Celeste stayed close the whole time. Not possessively, not as a statement, just, dear, in the way that meant something deliberate. When someone asked how we knew each other, she said simply, he's with me, and moved the conversation on. I felt those 3 words somewhere below where words usually land. A week after the gallery, I said the thing I'd been carrying. We were in the pottery room, late on a Saturday afternoon. She was working on something new, and I'd been watching her without talking, because that had become its own kind of comfortable. Then she put the piece down and looked at me. Tell me what's actually going on, she said, not the surface version. I leaned back against the work table. I keep thinking about what happens when the renovation is done. She waited. That I'm something you have access to right now, I said. Something that feels real when the doors are closed, and the rest of your life isn't in the room. And that eventually you'll look up and decide that's all it was. The room went quiet. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she stood up and walked out without a word. I heard her heels on the hardwood in the corridor, then the front door, then nothing. I stood there feeling like an idiot for having said it, and also knowing I'd needed to say it for weeks. She was gone maybe 8 minutes. When I heard the front door again, I went to the hallway. She came in carrying a manila envelope and a set of keys that she placed on the console table without ceremony. Her face had the same quality it had the very first morning I'd met her, resolved, already on the other side of whatever decision she'd just made. Outside, she said. We went out to the front drive. The evening was clear for once, the mountains above North Van catching the last light, the inlet down below gone dark and still. Parked near the cedar hedge was a truck I had to look at twice. An old Ford F-100, probably early 70s, fully restored, dark green, chrome trim. The kind of thing I'd pointed out through the window of her Volvo one afternoon in Kerrisdale when we were driving back from getting food. I'd said something offhand about how somebody had done beautiful work on the body. I hadn't thought she'd registered it. I stood there looking at it for a long moment. Then, I looked at her. Celeste. The envelope first. I opened it. Inside were documents I had to read twice before they made sense. A commercial lease agreement for a space in East Van. Brick building, corner lot, 2 bays, storage in the back. The kind of space that costs more per month in this city than I made in a good quarter. Below the lease, a second set of keys on a separate ring. I had a lawyer look at it 3 weeks ago, she said. The previous tenant was a body shop. The bones are exactly right. Your name is on the lease. My mouth went dry. Celeste, I can't. You told me what you wanted that night at Ambleside, she said. You said it like it was something that might happen in another lifetime. I don't believe in waiting for other lifetimes. She looked at me steadily. And before you say anything about it being too much, it's a building and a truck. What it is, Drew, is me removing every single reason you could still give yourself for thinking this isn't real. She bought me a truck and a workshop because I told her I was afraid I was only something private. Would you have taken it, or would that have felt like too much? Tell me in the comments. I looked at the papers, then at the truck, then at her. Why was all I had left. She crossed the drive and stopped in front of me, close enough that I could see the weariness in her face, that she usually kept behind something more composed. Because I want the mornings where I know where you are, she said. Because I want your coffee cups on my counter and your drop cloths in my garage. Because I've spent years in rooms full of impressive people, and I have never once felt seen by any of them the way I feel seen by you standing in front of a paint chip in bad morning light. She stopped then, and because I love you, that's the whole reason, that's all of it. The last part came out quietly, no lead up, no build, just a fact she'd decided to stop keeping to herself. I don't remember crossing the distance between us. I remember the way the envelope bent between us when I pulled her in, and the way she exhaled against my shoulder like she'd been bracing for something that hadn't come. Below us, the lights of West Van were coming on one by one across the hillside. The inlet had gone silver in the last of the dusk. In my hand, the keys to the truck. In the envelope, the address of a building with my name on the door. In front of me, her, still and real and not going anywhere.